Hello, everybody. My name is Brad Walsh. I am the host, producer, and founder of the Empowerography podcast platform, a globally rated in the top 2% podcast. I have published over 600 episodes and interviewed well over 650 women. And I am here today to present to you episode 5 of Beyond the Mic. So, welcome to Beyond the Mic. Episode 5. This is a little series I started to help provide tips and tricks for podcast hosts as well as podcast guests. The focus so far has been for podcast hosts, and I'm going to continue on that path for a little bit more. So, in today's episode, I'm going to speak to you about the importance of podcast assets. So things like graphics for your podcast, graphics to promote your podcast, intros and outros to add on to your podcast episode in the editing process, as well as trailers and transcriptions and things like that. So I want to start out by talking about intros and outros. Now, when you're in the editing process, it's always good to have an intro and outro to your podcast for when it gets published and put out there for the public to consume your content. The intro just gives a little bit of an intro to who you are and what your podcast is all about to bring people into your energy and into your space. It's always good to have some music in there as well, just to keep people intrigued and interested, talking a little bit about the podcast, give them a heads up as to who your guest is for that episode. And then, of course, the outro, you want to thank your guest for being a guest on your show that for that episode, as well as let people know where they can connect with you, where they can find you, where they can subscribe and listen to your podcast, where they can connect with you. They want to connect and talk to you about being on your podcast, being a guest on your podcast, or just get more information about who you are and what you do. So your social media handles and all of those things, you want to let people know where they can connect with you and learn a bit more about who you are. And of course, like I said, thank your guest for being a guest on your show. And of course, you want to include some music, underlying music underneath the speaking part of your intro and your outro. It's always good to have a little bit of music in there as well, just to hold the interest of your guests. And again, to thank them for being on your show and introduce them to your audience, as well as doing the intro and outro. I think it's very important for podcast assets in terms of promoting each episode. So what I do is I have a template that I use where I share a little bit about, so it's got the episode number, it's got the date it was released, it's got a picture of my guest and a little bit about who they are and what they do. And of course their name. And that helps to promote the episode. When you publish your episode, I send those assets out. So what I do is I have a still image that I use with that podcast episode template, as well as an audiogram. So I create an audiogram, and what I do is I take a little snippet from the episode so that people have an idea of what they're in store for, what they're going to get, a little bit of information, something, a very um, incentivized clip to pull them in so that they want to listen. So you pull a very important nugget out of the episode and create an audiogram with that. So I use that to publish. When I publish each episode, I put out an audiogram so that people listening, or for potential listeners, they can get an idea of what we're going to talk about or what we spoke about in that episode. I think that's incredibly important. Now, you may have some people that say audiograms aren't as impactful as they used to be. I still like to use the audiogram, and I make sure that I send those audiograms and the still image template to each one of my guests so that they can promote the episode as well on their social media handles and channels, so that they can also open up their audience to what they did with me in that episode, what we talked about. And again, it helps to gain listenership for me and for the Empowerography podcast platform. And so creating these things, it's just two templates, two pieces of promotional material, promotional assets, but I always make sure I send them to my guests so that they can also promote the episode, which of course is very important, because the more you promote your episode, the more listeners, the more potential listeners you can get, and the more beneficial it is to your platform, because that then in turn can turn into subscribers and fans of your podcast, which is obviously what you want. You want more and more people listening to your podcast, downloading and consuming your content so that they can get into your space and energy and learn more about the platform. and fans, and they can share with their friends. So it's really a ripple effect that you're creating by providing these assets, because you're getting access to your guests' audience that you normally wouldn't have access to. So creating those assets for your guests is very important. And of course, it's important for you too, as the host, to promote your episode. Another thing that I like to do, and most podcasters do, is show notes, having show notes. So when you publish your episode on Apple or Spotify, Stitcher, all of the podcasting platforms, you create show notes. So it gives the person an idea of what they're getting in the podcast episode, that particular episode. So what I do is I will put my guest's bio in there so that the potential listener can see who the person is, what they do, get a little bit of insight as to who they are. And then what I do is I also take, um, I provide three facts or three things that each um, episode is going to, the value that each of these three things. I pick three things in particular out of each episode that will be valuable to the listener, something that they're going to learn by listening to the episode. So I pick three very important points, put those in my show notes. I also take three quotes from each episode and put those in there for the listeners. And then, of course, a link to any offers that I have going on at the time, hashtags so that it entices more people to listen and reach more people through the audience by putting in the hashtags. And all of these things helped, again, to bring in listeners to your episode and give some insight and some background as to who each guest is for each episode. All of these things are very important. Now, they do have apps out there and programs that will help you write your show notes, which is great. ChatGPT you can use to create show notes as well. It's just very important to have show notes so that you give a little bit of information about the episode that that person is going to listen to and give some background on your guest so that they see who the guest is and what they do, and they can decide, okay, this is something I really want to listen to. Of course, creating titles for your podcast episodes is important as well. There are so many facets and pieces to the podcast episode puzzle when you're putting an episode out there. But these are some of the most important pieces, in my opinion, is the show notes, the intro and outro, which is, of course, part of post-production. You could even create trailers when you're first launching your podcast or for each episode if you want. I personally don't provide trailers or create trailers for each episode, but that is also something you could do, is create a little trailer. So if you're recording the video portion of your podcast, you can just take a snippet, a trailer, and turn that into a trailer for your podcast episode. You can also do that for launching your podcast when you're first starting out, where it will give people an idea of what the podcast is all about. So you can hype up before you even launch to get people interested and aware that you're going to be launching a podcast. So this is another way to help promote and bring listeners in, is through trailers. So you can do trailers for episodes, you can do trailers pre-launch for your podcast, all of these things. And you can also create transcriptions of the episode and provide those. I've seen podcast hosts that do provide entire transcripts of the whole episode, and they put those in the show notes as well. So that's something else that you can do as well. And these are just some of the main things that I found in my journey as a podcaster that are very helpful and necessary when you are creating a podcast, when you are launching a podcast. And as you go through launching each episode, these things are necessary parts of the podcast puzzle for you to include in each episode and as part of each episode. I hope this episode was helpful to each of you. I am going to put the link above the video for you to book in for a discovery call if you would like, to also join my wait list for my Start Your Own Podcast from idea to implementation in under 90 days. Start Your Own Podcast. I'll put the link as well in there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'd love to hear any feedback or comments you might have. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you for the next episode. I'm going to be talking about the importance of connecting with your guests and having them share your episode, and why that's so important and such an important piece of the podcast puzzle as a podcast host. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.